Yeah, my basic core business is syndicated newspaper cartoonists. Back in '97, when I was finishing up law school, I was required to write, effectively a thesis on a topic of my choosing, and I had a lifelong interest in syndicated newspaper cartoons, so I thought, why don't I write on that? And sure enough, I contacted several dozen newspaper cartoonists because that was back in the era of the internet is new, and we're going to put our email address on our newspaper cartoons and see what the audience writes to us. And so I wrote to a whole bunch of newspaper cartoonists, and sure enough, they wrote back to me, they called me. They were very excited to hear from me because there used to be two lawyers in the newspaper cartoon world, and one of them passed away, and the other one was disbarred and thrown in jail for stealing client money. So, so there was literally nobody in the field, and I mean, it's not a huge field. There were, maybe 350 professional newspaper cartoonists, but they had no one to represent them. And so I got a hold of the Universal Press Syndicate boilerplate contract, and the editor-in-chief there, the man who discovered Bill Watterson, Lynn Johnston, Kathy Geiswhite, he was nice enough to just send me their boilerplate contract because I asked. And so I wrote a 100-page thesis where I went through every line of his contract and analyzed everything that was being done. And I wrote a 20-page introduction about the business of syndicated cartoonists. And so when I was done, I published that online. And suddenly, before I'd even graduated or passed the bar, I was the world expert on syndicated cartoonist contracts. And so in a couple of years after I graduated, I worked for what's now Bingham McCutcheon in their IP department. And I represented several newspaper cartoonists through the firm and sort of informally talked to a number of them outside of the firm for those few years. That first year as a lawyer, I was invited by the National Cartoonist Society to speak at their annual convention. So I had been a lawyer for about 3.5 months before I was standing in front of 70% of the nation's newspaper cartoonists giving a lecture about their business. And so, it was great. I mean, you just walked into this void, and then after being at Bingham McCutcheon for a couple of years, I met the woman who would become my wife, and she was graduating from law school in 6 months, and so I followed her out here to San Diego, started my own solo practice, and so I already had this whole group of people who were in desperate need of my services. And then about 2 months after I arrived here, Universal Press Syndicate, which was the second biggest syndicate at the time and is now the biggest syndicate, they were in the midst of this whole internet boom. And they decided they were going to spin off. You remember the late 1990s and that first internet boom. And they decided they were going to spin off the electronic rights to all of their work, and they had Doonesbury and Garfield, and so they had reason to believe that in this new world of real estate on the internet, that they had something that they might be able to grow for a couple of years and package up and then do an IPO. Well, that didn't work out so well for them, but for me, there were 50 or 60 newspaper cartoonists who they'd had under contract for many years, and suddenly they were spinning off this division, so they had to have a new contract with all of their artists for the online rights. So suddenly, all of these people who were locked in these long-term, 10, 15, 20-year contracts, they all needed a lawyer. Well, that was a really good position to be in since I was the only one. And so about 3 months after I started my solo practice, I was already representing more than half of the lineup at Universal Press Syndicate because they needed this complicated internet document done. And so, basically I just walked into this area that's still to this day, my home field advantage. but I've expanded into a number of other fields that I'll talk about in a minute. But so that's my background. That's how I just sort of blundered into having a pretty nice little solo practice. So what I'd like to do is talk about each of the markets that are my current markets, and then a couple of my markets that used to be material markets, but whether the internet or the economy, whatever, has basically destroyed them. So it's kind of interesting because you'll see with the markets that I'm currently in, some of them are headed toward that direction of not being markets in 10, 15 years. But I do encourage you, please, to interrupt me because I don't like speaking. I like question and answer sessions a lot better. But let me just give you a brief overview of newspaper comic strip syndication, since that's my home field. When I graduated in 1997, newspapers were not as healthy as they had been in the 80s, but they were still in pretty good shape. The internet was new, hadn't undermined their basic business model. People like me still got the newspaper. Nobody really went to AOL at the time to get all their news. And then there was the whole internet coming along, and the comic strip syndicates thought that, oh wow, people will go directly to our website. So they were very excited, and so business was good. And then the 2000s hit, and newspapers tanked, and there was no real way to monetize the cartoons online. So the whole industry kind of started to go up when I first got into it, and then just has been in slow decline ever since. And you're all probably pretty familiar with how newspapers are going, and so that's it's been the fate of the cartoonist to basically follow the newspaper's decline. And so there used to be several hundred newspaper cartoonists. There are probably 75 fewer of them now. There's probably in the low 200s. And then that's probably just going to continue off into the future. I think I already talked a little bit about my typical clients and my source of clients. It's pretty much all word of mouth now. Somebody goes online, they type in syndicated newspaper cartoonist lawyer, I pop up, they talk to their friends, the friends talk about me. Even the syndicates, even people like King Features that are pretty tough, they have dealt with me for so many years. They'd rather deal with me than deal with a Hollywood entertainment lawyer who doesn't know what to ask for and doesn't understand the contours of their market. The thing that makes newspaper cartoonists need a lawyer as opposed to many other entertainment subspecialties that I'm involved in is that newspaper syndication contracts are long-term. Very often when somebody signs with a syndicate, they're with that syndicate forever. The initial contract is 10 to 20 years. There's a renewal right in there, or a right of first negotiation. So when somebody is offered a syndication contract, they know after reading it that this is probably the company that they're going to be dealing with for life. And so it's not like you're talking about a 3-month commitment. It's not like you're writing a book that it's going to take you 3 months or 6 months. It's not like you're writing a screenplay that, again, is going to be 3 months or 6 months. When you sign a newspaper syndication contract, it's as close to forever as a contract is likely to be. And so people need a lawyer, and they know it, and so they go out, they look for a lawyer, they end up on my doorstep. The legal issues in newspaper syndication contracts are what you would expect. There's a battle over the duration of the contracts. Am I going to get my freedom after 5 years, after 10 years, after 15 years? Or am I going to be sort of a restricted free agent after that period of time? It used to be the case that newspaper cartoonists worked for the syndicates, and they were not employees, but they were contract people. And then sort of in the late 1980s, it shifted so that ownership stayed with the artists. And then sort of by the mid-1990s, that was standard. And then I got involved. And I pushed that pendulum a little bit too far toward the artist side. I would make sure that the artists had their freedom or close to their freedom at the end of those contract terms. And when a couple of artists either drove hard bargains or switched syndicates, the newspapers kind of clamped down on those, on what I was doing by the mid 2000, like 2005 or so. One syndicate that had no lawyer, a few years later had 3 lawyers and a contract administrator. I mean, I like to claim responsibility for that, but partly it was that they were into new media, but a good portion of it was the fact that they were pushing back against what I was trying to do in terms of shortening the contract term. Syndication has always been sort of the core, but that has flatlined in terms of growth. I mean, pretty much nobody is getting rich off of newspapers anymore, I mean, in any field. And so the syndicates and the artists, they're all looking toward Hollywood. You've seen a movement toward comic strip based movies, like Peanuts is coming out next year with a full-scale animated feature. Marmaduke was a live action feature a couple of years ago. There are a whole bunch of other projects in the works and a couple other ones that have actually come out in the past. There have been TV shows. Pretty much everybody who's a newspaper cartoonist thinks that they should also have a movie or a TV show. And so there's certainly a lot of movement toward that. Both of the existing major syndicates have one of the big Hollywood agencies representing them, trying to move the work toward live action or animation. Anthology books used to be a big thing. You probably remember the Calvin and Hobbes books and the Far Side books and even Bloom County books from the 80s and the 90s. Those things are just dead in the water. I have clients who have been published for 20 years with major publishers, and they just get a call saying, "Well, no, we're done." And the clients are like, "What do you mean we're done? We've been publishing with you for 20 years." No, well, there's just no market. There's no space on the bookshelves, and nobody buys ebooks of cartoon anthologies anymore. And so that market has more or less evaporated. Reprints, you've probably seen, everybody cuts out newspaper cartoons and puts them on their desk, and you've probably seen them republished from time to time. It's like this big of a market in relation to the total income from newspaper sales. So syndication is just this steady to declining market. And are there any questions? Yes.
I have a question.
Sure.
I was wondering, because you're talking about the agreements.
Yes.
How much, I imagine it varied from artist to artist, or maybe it didn't. I assume when the cartoonist came to the newspaper with their art that they had so far and their ideas and everything else, how specific would those agreements, when they were fleshed out, address the content? We want you to stick with what you've presented with us, using these characters or using this theme. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
I'm just wondering how much they
Well, the industry is structured around, you have 1,500 or so daily newspapers in the country, and those are marketed to by what used to be dozens, and then by 1997 was a half a dozen or so major comic strip syndicates. They're kind of like the funnel. And so those are the people that the cartoonists deal with, is the syndicate. And then the syndicate goes out and sells to newspapers. And so when a new feature is launched, it's sold to the syndicate, and then the syndicate, So I do my deals with the syndicates. I've never talked business with a newspaper for a syndicated cartoon.
So does the syndicate do that?
What the syndicate does is the syndicate will work with an artist during a development period to refine the submission. Typically it's a third. A third of the ones come in, they're basically ready to go. There are a couple little nitpicks, and then they get launched. A third of them, typically the person will come in with like 12 characters, and the syndicate will say, well, how about 4? And so they whittle it down. And then Another third of them, the basic idea is there, but the syndicate has to put a lot into the development period, and so the actual contracts just have a general, we have editorial supervision over you, and when it comes to new launches, if we don't like what you do, we just don't launch you. And then when it comes to what people do after launch, there's a lot more flexibility. When you have a client list of 200 newspapers, you can add a dog. Like, I mean, dog and cats are how you make money in newspaper cartoons. But the syndicates don't want another dog and cat feature because there's so many, and the newspapers say they don't want another dog and cat feature. So what I tell people is, start your family feature, and once it's launched, then you add your cat and dog when nobody can do anything about it. And so that's the general way it works in terms of the creative. But I mean, the syndicates have always had a huge amount of submissions to choose from, and so they just kind of pick and choose things that are pretty close. Or so. Yes.
I guess since the market is slowly drying up, are the younger cartoonists even going the syndicate route, or are they just going?
No,
straight?
that's point number two. That's the web cartoons. That's where it's fun. That's where it's still still interesting. I had this one guy. Well, the big syndicates used to launch in total about 14 new comic strips per year. Each of the majors would launch between 2 and 4. Now it's 1 per major, and there are only like 3 majors left. So it's gone from when I started 12 to maybe 3 a year, sometimes 2. And so the market is really drying up. And that's actually not a bad thing because there isn't enough room to support a lot of new entrants. And so if you're in newspapers now, you're probably going to be successful for the rest of your life. If you're not in newspapers, you can just kind of forget it. Unless you really win the lottery. I had this one guy recently who was an online cartoonist, and the syndicate was aware of his work, and it was pretty okay. But then he spent a couple of weeks creating a new idea, sent it to the syndicate. The syndicate's eyes just popped out, and we have to have this. I mean, it's going to be launched in the not too distant future. It's amazing, and I showed it to my kids. My kids, who are 8 and 11, loved it. I loved it. My wife loved it. I mean, they're perfect content that is edgy but not too edgy, can still find a home in the newspaper comics page, but it's really rare. Where the action is in web cartoons, and I passed around some of the work that I do. I have an extremely narrow niche. My wife and I create law-themed cartoons for the legal market. Our biggest client is West Academic, and they send us about 200 short summaries of cases, and we cartoon them. So then they publish a study aid series called High Court Case Summaries, and they put our cartoon next to their summary, and that's the book. So over the past 10 or 11 years, we've created about 2,000 cartoons that are from the major case books in law school. So I've covered virtually every single case that is taught in con law, crim pro, evidence, corporations, and then for most of the other basic subjects, I have a very large coverage, but it's not quite totality. And then that material is available online because they have the right to just print the work in their actual High Court Case Summary series. I retain all the other rights. And so I run a iTunes for Law Cartoons website, and it's search engine optimized, and I sell reprint rights to people like me who are doing CLE presentations and they want to jazz up the presentation, or they are a solo practitioner. My best market is wills and trusts lawyers. They market to individuals, and so they want to have something that kind of breaks up the extremely dry and kind of sad text that they have to send out. And so I have a very thriving business based mostly on lawyers finding my work from Google searches. And so that's one hyper niche oriented subject matter that wouldn't have worked before the age of the internet because there would have been no way to get to all the lawyers. There are just dozens of other thriving niches for cartoonists. And it's pretty exciting that people who would have never fit into the newspaper comics page, all of a sudden they have an outlet. There are these guys, some of whom make an immense amount of money doing mostly video game themed cartoons. There are, I forget the exact number, but probably in excess of 10 million teenagers and guys mostly in their 20s who are video game enthusiasts who go online every single day. I mean, we talk about a number like 10 or 20 million people going online every day. It's kind of like giant newspaper circulation level. And so these people can make real money off of just advertising when you have eyeballs like that. And then they go around to the various comic conventions and they sell merchandise, they sell anthology reprint books. And I mean, I had this one client who did this really, I mean, it was not specific to pretty much anything cartoon. It was just, you know, very newspaper cartoon-like. And he got picked up because he was relatively well known in the online world by one of the major syndicates. Launched, it crashed, it burned. It got like 5 newspapers. Didn't hear from him for years. Went to the San Diego Comic-Con, and there he was. Corner booth, walls of product, and like 5 people deep waiting to buy it. I mean, crashed and burned online, I mean, in newspapers, but he had built this thriving, very loyal niche online. And so there are all sorts of people who have built careers in cartoons online. As I put down in the materials here, the internet giveth and taketh away for web cartoons. This is one of my most popular cartoons. It's a Trust and Estates cartoon. It's Mr. Frosty, it's March, time to talk estate planning. I have sold this 5 times a year for the last 10 years. It's on my homepage now because it sells so well, and it's one of the dozen or so cartoons that really give me a very thriving online reprint business. My wife was doing some search engine optimization. She was on Google, and then she saw this. Looks suspiciously similar, doesn't it? I mean, if you compare the two, it's the same basic joke. Frosty looks just about the exact same. I mean, it's an obvious takeoff. So I wrote the guy, who's a lawyer, and he said, and I basically said cease and desist. He says, a marketing firm in Texas produced this for us. I will remove it as an old post anyway. Can you send me a link or something from what you say it is based upon so I can compare it? Well, that all sounds like maybe he's an innocent infringer, unless you look at a different post of his from 3 months earlier where he specifically mentions my website and the page that cartoon was on, saying, I found the creator of the card has several cartoons on estate planning in the link to my webpage. So, I mean, as a copyright lawyer, I mean, yes, this is indirect. He's created new material because this is not a direct copy. But in terms of proving access, I mean, I've got him nailed. But I mean, what can you really do about it? I mean, not much. Send a cease and desist, they take it down. Go ahead.
I assume you register your
Oh, yes.
work. Don't you get statutory damages?
I would, yes. My wife was so upset by this. We did investigate suing the guy. And the fact of the matter is that there's yes, I can prove access. And, a jury would almost certainly say, yeah, that's copying. But what are the damages gonna be? You know, are they gonna really award you enough money to make it worth actually suing? Probably not. So I just moved on. Go ahead.
What kind of money would he have made off
Would I have made off of
that?
suing?
No, the guy that.
It was just a post. That's the problem.
okay.
It's not like it was a blog post.
Oh, okay,
It's
yeah.
not like he put it on 10,000 t-shirts and I can get him for that. And so I'm not a litigator. And the litigator I talked to is like, oh, what are they gonna do? $5,000, $3,000, $10,000? I mean, it's not gonna be worth keeping a lawsuit going 2,500 miles away when you have to prove. And then there's the whole like, well, is it a joke? And then they would obviously say under copyright law you can't copy jokes, and then this is so much more than a joke. But you know, if it were worth $1 million, I would sue and have won, but it's not going to be. And so we kind of walked away from that one.
So kind of along those lines, I
Sure.
guess I'm just curious, what's your take on the whole, if it ever comes into being, the small claims copyright court that's been kind of going around?
That would be a great idea. I mean, there needs to be a credible remedy, because it really boils down to an education process, and I'm going to get to that, so that's a really good question. The internet has created this, well, if it's on Google Images, it's free. And so if there were a way for ordinary people to enforce their copyright in a way that wasn't obnoxious. I mean, somebody posts this. Really, I mean, is it worth $150,000? I mean, I'm as much a zealot as you could possibly be about creating or about creator rights, especially my rights. But I mean, no, it's not worth. I mean, it to threaten to ruin somebody's life over an infringement of this size is overkill. And so you need something that's a credible lawsuit, that's easy to enforce, so the other guy doesn't feel like if they give an inch, they might be taken for $150,000, and something that an ordinary person can file. So I am a big believer that the copyright system, the whole thing, is just a raging disaster. I mean, from pretty much every level. Trademark is amazing. Trademark makes sense. Trademark is for business, and I feel like as an area of the law, it's about as logical as they come. Copyright is bound up in politics and creativity, and just an epic disaster at practically every level. So when you're talking about changing things in the copyright law, I mean, creating half as big a disaster in a particular area as exists right now is improvement. And there are all sorts of problems with a small claims copyright court, but I think that anything that can turn the hundreds of thousands of infringement claims that would possibly be processed into a small number of credible claims that were proportionate to the offense would be helpful. Not because it fixes the problem, not because it doesn't create another half dozen problems as well, but just because something has to be done, especially for people like this. So next up is not indirect, sort of somebody redoes your work and rechanges your joke by a couple of words, but actual direct infringement. Take your work off the internet, put it on their website. This is a litigation boutique out of LA, has dozens of employees, and their little quotation on the side is that they're dedicated to protecting the rights of individuals against large corporate interests. They're not so dedicated to protecting little artists against big law firms, because, and I find this, and so it's an unlicensed use. I wrote a demand for payment. The next day, lo and behold, the image is gone. They never responded. And what am I going to do? Am I going to go up against an LA litigation boutique? I mean, they're just going to hand this case over to their brand new associate and say, case is worth like $3,000 max, you know, go ahead, try it, lose it, we don't care. So I didn't bother pursuing it, but I did react by going online, pulling every one of my images down, then slapping an overlay, gigantic copyright symbol on it. And so if you license the work from me, the download is watermark free. But this is pretty unmistakable. Nobody looking at this is gonna like think that's not copyrighted. Well, wrong. Again, a lawyer included it in a couple of my cartoons in presentations that he did, and one of my licensees wrote on Twitter, because the guy was, you know, posting this stuff on Twitter. One of my licensees found it, and she's this wonderful person who's like my own personal policeman. She, you know, alerts me and the infringers of any time she sees my work used without authorization. She's like, Stu Rees is a friend of mine, you shouldn't be using his work without permission, screenshots taken. He writes back, I purchased a license, this is after she calls him out publicly on Twitter, and contacted Stu. I found clip art elsewhere and didn't realize terms. Well, the reason why my client knew that it was unlicensed was because it had this, you know, the world's biggest Circle C on it. And, you know, lo and behold, the guy did license, but he licensed one cartoon because that was what she had pointed out. Well, I went on his website and found 3 uses. So even when called out on Twitter, a lawyer tried to get away with just paying for one of them rather than all 3. I mean, and I'm not talking about breaking the bank, it was $25 a piece. So he paid for one, like, oh, I didn't know the term. So basically, web cartoonists are in this really interesting situation where their business is made possible by the internet, and then a portion of it is taken away by the internet. And for the most part, they are serving areas that are not reprint based. They're looking now toward advertising based models and physical goods for sale at conventions. So that's how they kind of sidestep the infringement problem. The same way for musicians these days, album sales are down, so you wonder why these old bands, you know, are touring all the time. Well, the reason why they're touring all the time is because everyone knows their work, but it's hard to get people to buy albums these days. But, you know, Pat Benatar shows up at your local venue and you go see them, and people will pay $75 for a ticket to go sit in a seat, whereas they won't pay $10 for the album. And so it's the same way with cartoonists.